So now we have an idea of what evolution is. Let's talk about the history of the theory. Now, up until a certain point in history, our best guess for how old the Earth was came from theology, not from science. We went through the list of begats in the Old Testament. This person begat this person, begat this person. We just kind of counted backwards from this list in order to come to the figure of 6,000 years old is about when the Earth was created. But geologists started to notice that the geological processes that created mountains and then weathered those mountains away, that created canyons and created all these geological features, we knew that they took longer than that amount of time in order to actually form. And as geologists became more and more prestigious, they could tell you how to find coal, for instance, and you would listen to someone who could tell you how to find coal. This idea that the Earth was a little bit older started to kind of take root. So there's a geologist by the name of George Buffon, and he starts advocating for an old Earth. And the older the Earth is, the more time it gives for evolution to take shape. And this was very influential on a young Charles Darwin when he was coming up and learning about the nature of the world and about science. Now, in the 1700s, geologists started to note that there were fossils in certain kinds of rock, inside of sedimentary rock. And those fossils were from organisms, some of which still were alive today, but not all of them. There were organisms in the fossil record that no living human had ever seen in the flesh. Now, this was shocking to them because up until relatively recently, scientists didn't think that animals could go extinct. We just didn't think that that was something that could happen. You can see this belief in American history when you read stories about people shooting American bison from train cars and then just leaving the carcass there. For example, Thomas Jefferson loved mastodon fossils that were showing up in the Americas, and when he sent Lewis and Clark to go exploring, he told them to keep an eye out for any mastodons, because he didn't think that things could go extinct, so if there are fossils of it around, then there must be mastodons around. So this idea that organisms used to exist that now do not exist, that was a revolutionary kind of thought. But also, organisms that we know about today, at a certain depth in the fossil record, they just kind of disappear. You see things that are like them, but not quite the same. And if you go even deeper, you stop seeing those organisms that are like them. So in every layer of fossils, we were seeing different organisms showing up. Now, to understand the importance of that, you have to realize that the deeper you go in the fossil record, the older the fossils are. So what we were seeing was this progression of forms of life through the geological record. And if the look of the fossils was changing, maybe that meant that the look of the living organisms at that time had changed from generation to generation over the course of many, many eons. If there were organisms that were alive in the past that are not alive today, and there are organisms that are around today that were not around in the past, well, either at some point everything must have reset, or organisms changed over time. So this idea of evolution started to be kicked around. Now, the first person to really put forward a working hypothesis, a working model of evolution, how it functions, what the actual mechanism of evolution was a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Jean-Baptiste, you thought I was going to say Charles Darwin, but he's not in this story yet. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck thought that organisms evolved through what he called acquired characteristics. So over the course of their lifetime, he thought that organisms kind of picked up traits. So for instance, if you work out a lot, you're a person, you're lifting weights constantly, you're doing a lot of working out, you would build up muscle. So you would acquire the characteristic of having large arm muscles over time. And then he thought that that characteristic could then be passed on to your offspring, that your offspring would then be born with larger muscles because of how much you worked out over the course of your life. Not maybe as big as yours, but they'd get a little bit of that benefit of you working out. And then he thought over hundreds of thousands of generations, these tiny little acquisitions of traits over the course of your lifetime would add up and you get organisms changing over time. Now we now know that is wrong. That is not how evolution works. That said, it is somewhat similar to the rapidly developing field of epigenetics, wherein experiences that your parents had or things that they were exposed to over the course of your lifetime can, as it turns out, affect the expression of your genes, just not in the same way that Lamarck was thinking. So he was wrong about the idea of evolution through acquired characteristics, but we do have to give him credit for coming up with a pretty feasible idea of how it might work. He also invented the word biology. He's the first one to use the term biology in its modern sense, so we can give him a little bit of slack on not quite having the mechanism of evolution correct. So here's Lamarck's theory of evolution in practice. We have a population of organisms which are kind of gazelle-like. They have slightly long legs, and they are eating leaves. There's a very, very dry year, one year, let's say, and instead of eating grass, they have to turn up and try to get the leaves. Now, as we eat all the leaves on the bottom row of this tree towards the ground, those organisms are going to have to try to stretch their neck out in order to try to get the next set of leaves up there. And Lamarck thought that organisms were inherently plastic in nature. Not plastic like the material, but plastic like malleable, like we were made out of clay. And that by stretching their neck up, that it would kind of concentrate life force energy in their neck, and it would actually cause some growth to occur, which would cause their neck to actually get longer. Maybe not noticeably longer, but longer. And then when you had offspring, those offspring would be born with a slightly longer neck, so the next generation would have a longer neck, and then longer, and then longer, and then longer, until eventually you end up with something like a giraffe able to get the leaves from the top of the tree. The difference between Lamarck's idea of evolution and our modern idea is that the variation in organisms is already there in the population. Some organisms have long necks and some have short. The ones with longer necks, if that's advantageous, they will survive and reproduce more successfully than the ones with short necks, so the next generation will just have more long necks as a result. Make sure you have this idea right in your head, because I often find that even after we cover all the evolution stuff, students still think that Lamarck's theory of evolution is correct. So you do not actually stretch your neck by trying to stretch it out. You only pass on the genes that you have for your neck length to the next generation, and then they work with what they got. The next mechanism of evolution was proposed by a man by the name of Charles Darwin. Here he is. We finally get to talk about Charles Darwin. Here he is seen way at the left at the very beginning of his career as a naturalist when he set forth on a voyage on the HMS Beagle, and then on the right here we have him when he's old and about when he's already published The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. I like to call this slide Handsome Darwin, Wizard Darwin. Charles Darwin came from a wealthy family. His father was a physician, so he thought that he would probably become a physician later in life as well. So he decided to go to medical school. So he went to medical school, and back in the day when you went to medical school, what would happen is you would have your professor down in a kind of a circular pit with a table here, and he would do surgery on someone in front of all of the med students and lecture while he was doing surgery. Now this is before the time of surgical anesthetics, so surgery was very, very painful, and you typically had to have a couple of large guys, large attendants, standing by that would just hold the patient down so he didn't squirm around too much when you were trying to cut into him. Charles Darwin got to medical school and he observed the amputation of a limb of a young child with no surgical anesthetic, and after that experience he decided that medicine was simply not for him, and I feel like I can empathize with that position given that experience. Later he thought maybe he'll go into the clergy, because he was always really interested in nature and gardens and insects and things like that. And he thought he went into the clergy. If he became like a pastor for a small village or something, well, he knew that a large part of that job is just kind of walking along from house to house, talking to people and checking out gardens and working in the garden out in the back. And he thought this would give him enough time to think about nature and study this sort of thing. So he studied theology at the University of Edinburgh. But he was a difficult man to get along with at times, and he got into lots and lots of arguments with his theology professors at that time. His interpretation of certain sections of Scripture were different from the prevailing interpretation, so they were butting heads. And about this time, he's thinking, maybe I'm not going to be a theologist either. What he really wants to do is study naturalism. And his naturalist professors, his natural science professors, really recommended him as a candidate to study natural sciences. So when a posting came up on a survey ship, a ship that's going to sail around the South American coast and map the coastline, there was a position for a naturalist. And his professor said, hey, Chuck, come on. Get on this boat, get on the HMS Beagle here, sail around the world and study all of the birds and insects and mammals and plants and everything that you can possibly find on your way there. So he set sail on this voyage, and this is when his interest in naturalism really started to take hold and really started to take off. As he went around the world, he was struck by how there were different organisms in every location, but there was a limited number of kinds of organisms, if that makes sense. So he would find islands like the Galapagos, and he would see that there were finches, and maybe there was one species of finch on the mainland, but on the island there were 24 species of finches. Each one slightly different in its traits, but very, very well adapted to the unique microclimate in which it found itself. Adapted to a different food source, adapted to different kinds of mating calls, different shapes of beaks, all these kinds of traits. So he starts to think, why would all these organisms look similar to each other if each one was created separately, right? Why would you kind of go back to the same design over and over and over again? Why not create entirely different kinds of organisms? And do I really think that this kind of finch and that kind of finch aren't related to each other on any level? It's what he's saying at this point is, I know that there's an organism called a coyote, and I know there's an organism called a wolf, and I think those organisms are more closely related than, say, a gorilla and a coyote would be. But if they're more related to each other, that means they share ancestry, which means that at some point the original species that they came from diverted into these other two species. So he's already starting to play with this idea of evolution. He sees marine iguanas, so he sees tree iguanas, right, that are very well adapted for eating insects in the branches. They got the coloration to blend in with the trees. They're very good at climbing trees. But he also sees marine iguanas that have a flattened tail that allows them to swim through the water. They have a muddled dark coloration that helps them blend in with the dark colored algae on the rocks below, and they actually scrape algae off of rocks in order to eat them. He sees all kinds of different organisms, and he starts writing down his things, and he did a lot of what I call shooting stuff biology. He went around and he captured and shot different organisms, tagged them, and then brought them back to Europe in order to study them later on. So he spent 4 years cruising around on the Beagle before he returned home to sit and think about what he had experienced, all the different organisms he had seen, and what mechanism may have caused them to become so well adapted to the various ecosystems that they found themselves in. Now, he wrote down all of his ideas in his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, which he wrote many, many drafts of, and he wrote a lot of scientific papers, always kind of flirting around this idea of evolution by natural selection, but never really quite committing to it. He doesn't want to rock the boat because he knows that this idea is going to be controversial and it's going to be unpopular. Before he puts it out there, he wants to make sure that he's thought of every possible red flag that someone could bring up, every possible argument that someone could make about how it's wrong. He went out and he found evidence in order to deal with that idea. And then he would find evidence for something else. And then he would come up with another idea. Well, maybe it's wrong because of this. And he'd find evidence in order to dispute that claim. And he'd thought about it for decades. He'd sat on this idea for a very long time. And he may have never actually published his book, except that he got a letter. And he got a letter by a man by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. And Alfred Russel Wallace had been on his own journey around the world. He had spent a lot of time in South Asia and the Indian Ocean and this kind of area over here. And he had also noticed things that Darwin had noticed, that all of these different organisms seem to have similar forms and are all very well adapted to their own particular ecosystems. Maybe they've changed over time, maybe they've adapted through natural selection, and he knows that Darwin's interested in this kind of stuff, so he wants to know what Darwin thinks about his idea. And in this letter, he basically outlines Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in his own words. And then Darwin reads this letter and he thinks, I'm going to get scooped! My entire life I've been working on this book, and someone is going to publish it before me? I gotta run to the publisher. So he sends his book out and he finally publishes his manuscript. And the benefit of having spent all of that time thinking about it ahead of time is that, yes, people did come through with arguments against this idea. People hated this idea, so they threw everything they could at it, but Darwin had already found the evidence to dispute their claims, to counter their arguments. Say, oh yes, you would be correct about that, but have you considered this aspect? Because I already have. Early on this semester, I said that a hypothesis is a good hypothesis if it could, in principle, be disproved. And evolution was a very good hypothesis because all you would need to disprove the entire model of evolution as we kind of understand it today, find rabbit fossils in Precambrian rock. Find fossils for a highly evolved modern organism in a rock strata that occurs prior to when we think that organism should have shown up, and the whole thing would shatter the ground. But we never find that. We only ever find evidence that is consistent with this idea of evolution by natural selection. We tweak little things here and there, but it has held up to everything that people could throw at it. People try to disprove it left and right. And once a theory has been supported over and over and over and over again, and it's become a rich model of the universe that makes new predictions, new kinds of hypotheses can be generated from this basic idea that's been very well supported. Now it's a theory. So when we say that evolution is the bedrock theory of biology, we're using theory to put it up on a pedestal. A theory is not a guess. That is how most people use the term theory. Dictionary definition 1. But when scientists say theory, we mean that that is a rigorous model of the universe that makes extremely good predictions and is incredibly well supported by the available evidence.